experience been at JLF this year? How is it different from Degree Paris? And because you also traveled quite afar as an author, so how's your experience with that this year?
I think this year, now that I have 3 books out, I have a lot more to talk about, a lot more interesting things to say, but also I'm moderating a lot of sessions, so the conversations are quite diverse. In terms of the venue, I think I quite prefer this because it's a little more intimate, isn't it? Yeah.
Yes, indeed. So there's always been a reluctance to talk about partition literature. I remember there's this in the forward to Do by Gulzar. He says something to the effect of we द्वितीय विश्व युद्ध के बारे में बात की, and that we somehow got over it, the Second World War. But there was never this reluctance to talk about partition, and we somehow never went over it. So how do you see that changing in recent years with your books coming and other authors also working on this?
I don't think you can completely eradicate the reluctance to speak about it. What you can do is encourage younger people to ask about it. I think that's what's changing. There's no reason why a person who's gone through partition will probably open up on their own about at least the violence or the trauma. They may talk about the childhood memory or other things to do with pre-partition life, but to really know about the time period and the expulsion from one place and migration to another, I think the generation needs to ask, the younger generation needs to ask, and I see that happening, yes.
Can you please tell our readers about your latest book?
Yeah, I have a novel that came out in December 2022 called The Book of Everlasting Things. And it is about 2 families, one of a perfumer and the other of a calligrapher, and how they lived through World War I, World War II, partition, and then post-partition migration to the West.
So, how is because you first written 2 non-fiction books, so how's the process different, and how is the process of writing non-fiction and fiction? How do they like interplay, and how do they incorporate into each other if they do?
It's a great question. For me, there's a lot of intertextuality in my work. So there is a lot of referencing of subject matter that you will find in each of the books. I think the shift from nonfiction to fiction, my methodology is the same. Maybe my writing style has become a little bit different. The freedom with which I can control my narrative, because there's very little control you have over real people's real stories. You can't edit them, you can't change them, you can only interpret them. You have a lot of control over fiction, though, in the same way that fiction has a lot of control over you. So that, I think, that relationship is really interesting, and I had never experienced that before.
You record oral history and history of objects, and that was so extensively. Probably this is a question that has been asked of you quite a few times, but how's the process of that? How's the process of researching? How's the process of then writing it in a way which is a part of the same narrative?
The process of research, field research in particular, is probably my favorite, because it's actually a huge privilege to sit with somebody and listen to their story and receive that story. I think the process of writing is a little more complicated, because often you have to transcribe, maybe translate from the language that you're recording in, transliterate that text, and contextualize that text for a larger audience, because the conversation that you've had with somebody is quite intimate and private, and you need to put it in the larger framework of either national history or cultural history or ethnographic history, and you also need to draw patterns between that narrative and other narratives that you have recorded. So I spend a lot of time writing and doing secondary research as well. The weaving of fact and memory is something that is, thank you, the weaving together of maybe official narrative or fact and what people remember is something that I always try to do, to maybe offer a balanced narrative.
So your background is in fine arts. You also grown up among booksellers, and how does all that rich background tie into the work that you do?
I think actually it's a hugely privileged background to come from books, to come from art, to come from ways of looking. And I think sometimes I like it more because I'm not bound by the rules of writing. I didn't study writing, so a lot of things that come to me come with a certain level of freedom. Because I would say my first language is a visual language, I always try and put the visual into my text. And I think that this is quite helpful for me because it helps me to see the landscape I'm writing about, but also my reader enters into that landscape more easily than they would otherwise. I'm always looking for visual cues to put in, and authentic visual cues. But that's just the way I write. And of course, being born in a bookshop, the reading ever since I've been young has added subliminally also to that vocabulary.
Yeah. So, what are some of the books that you're reading right now?
That's a great question, actually. I have Deepthi Kapoor's Age of Vice on my nightstand that I haven't started reading. And a book that I finished recently was The Book of Goose by Yi Yun Lee, which is honestly, it's so different from anything I read, but it's fantastic and I was obsessed with it.
So yeah, and is there anything that you're working on right now?
I'm not working on anything at the moment. I'm thinking on what I want to write next and whether it is going to be fiction or non-fiction. Yeah, I think very few people have the luxury of this choice, and I want to be careful in what I do next. But I know that it's going to be within the realm of either history or historical fiction.
Has the reception of your fiction book and your non-fiction book have they been different?
Yet to be seen, because the novel only came out 2 weeks ago. It's quite new. Non-fiction, I think the relevance of non-fiction grows over time, right? I don't think, and I'm not interested in my books flying off the shelf on the first day and then 2 weeks later no one buying it. I'm interested in the fact that 10 years later, if someone asks, oh, what's a good book on this subject, someone says you should read this person. That is what I want. I want long-term investment from readers. I want an organic interest in the narrative, and I feel like that's what I want for my fiction as well. So I'm not interested in these quick sales and yeah.
No, I actually meant it more
I
in terms
understand.
of audiences.
Yeah, I understand.
Is there
It's
different kind of audience that has.
well, I'll give you one example. I usually never read my reviews, but like people post on Goodreads and Amazon and stuff like that. But recently, I read a little bit for the novel, and they're very interesting because they're talking about characters that I have imagined. And they're talking with detail and depth as if those are real characters. And one person says, oh, I have a crush on this journalist called Samir Khan. Or this person is very unlikable in the novel, but that means that it has a good character arc. So it's quite entertaining. Manner in which people receive fiction and non-fiction is different. Like, I never expect non-fiction readers to read my non-fiction books quickly. I want them to take time because it actually is very difficult to absorb and interpret the things that you've heard. But I'm very surprised when someone reads a novel in 2 days and writes a review about it, and I'm pleasantly surprised at things like that because it's so rare for me. That kind of gratification that someone has after reading a novel, sinking in a novel, is really beautiful.
Tell us a little bit about the kind of art you like. Because I love art, so I'd like to know what sort of art you enjoy. Any specific form of art? So,
I can tell you about the art that I did.
please.
Yeah. I trained to be a traditional printer, which means I studied metal engraving, lithography on limestone, screen printing, paper making, book making, letterpress, and I think it made me a hugely tactile person. You learn about color and depth and shadow and form. You learn about the sanctity of material. I worked with copper and zinc and limestone. I worked with wood. And I don't think I would have ever written the way that I write now if I hadn't done the artistic work that I did, because I draw from that language. I'm concerned with things like tactility and texture, especially in the novel. You can see I'm concerned with the world around me being a visceral world, being a world that you can feel like you are standing in, not a world that you have to force yourself to imagine.
So give me a list of your favorite artists. I'm not asking one. Give me a list of your favorite artists.
I don't know if I have a lot of favorite artists. Like, I enjoy the work of Sol Lewitt, Amrita Shergill, John Baldessari, Rothko's immense landscape of color, William Kentridge. Yeah.
So, do you feel limited in some way? This is also something that has always interested me, especially people who are more interested in the visual world around them, photographers, artists. Do you feel limited by the world of literature sometimes when you try capturing that emotive world?
I haven't felt limited yet. It's hard to say in the future, but I feel like I always draw from it. Like I always find a way to marry my text and language, not to keep them as independent. So, no, not for me.
I think the last one.
Excellent. Thank you.